yeah, this is the Southern Dirt's organised machinery demonstration in conjunction with Kojonup suppliers and also Macintosh Machinery. They've been kind enough to loan us a very nice tractor to use for the day. We're down at Theo Cunningham's place, just off Yonker Road. This paddock's called Heartbreak Ridge. As you can see, it's aptly named, with the granite breakaways and a fair bit of coffee rock coming up on the top of the country. What we're doing here is a bit of soil amelioration. So we've got the Grizzly Tiny that's owned by Kojonup suppliers, and that's digging down to about 300mm deep. So we're breaking through a bit of a compacted topsoil and also bringing up some clay into the surface to reduce some non-wetting. So the tractor's labelled at 620, but it's remapped, so it's running at about 700 horsepower. He's running at about 7% track slip, and he's only idling at about 1700 to 1800 revs per minute. Going uphill, he's using about 100 litres of fuel an hour. Downhill's probably about 65. The Grizzly Tiny is digging to 300 mils deep here, and only working on about 80% engine load. The discs are worn about 75%, so he could go deeper, normally down to 350, but that's enough for now. We've been dry hurrying this machine out. Minimum horsepower requirement is probably about 450 horsepower, but it really depends on your soil and the water content. Obviously, when you've got a bit more moisture, you can get away with lower horsepower. The cutting effective width is about 6.05 metres, something like that. Yeah, it's doing a really good job. We're turning some really poor low production soils into some of our best dirt. So yeah, it's actually being a bit of a game changer for some of our growers. So one of the ideal scenarios is to spread, 3 or 4 tonnes of lime, then we get the Grizzly to go across it, and we're incorporating it to that full 300mm depth. We're bringing up a lot of clay to the surface, as you can see in this demonstration, which is reducing our non-wetting. We're getting rid of compaction layer, and we're basically jump-starting that liming process to reduce our soil acidification. So we're basically buying ourselves 5 or 10 years worth of lime incorporation, which you'd have to wait for normally through soil turbation and water infiltration.
So I've been told this site's historically repellent. I'll probably do more of a Q&A type session because I haven't actually got anything specific to discuss. So if you have any questions and whatnot, we can discuss them. There is the thing about this site, probably a long-term pasture. So it's got a real thatchy topsoil where most of the pasture is actually really just concentrated in that top layer. And then it's got a little bit more organic rich layer down to around 10-12 centimetres, which is probably from cropping of oats or something every 10 years or so. And then below that will be the lighter coloured soil with a bit of clay underneath that. So it just highlights how, well, if you look at the paddock, it highlights how when you attack some of these soils when they're a little bit drier, you can start to see those layering of the soils come out quite well, and sometimes they're quite distinct layers when they roll out. So being repellent, the Tiny's done a pretty good job here bringing out some of the subsoil. So it's brought up a bit of clay, or some of the more clayey subsoil, a bit of the fresher soil from underneath. However, in terms of trying to address total repellency across the whole surface, there's still a lot of old topsoil, which is like these bits, still have a lot of old topsoil there which will still be repellent. So the repellency is partially addressed, but the advantage of something like the Tiny is its mixing ability. So if you've got an acidic profile, and you're trying to get lime at depth and mix a bit of lime in, something like the Tiny is ideal for that because it gives you the chance to get some of that lime into different layers and mix it through, as well as then you can come back through a little bit more lime on top to address any acidity that's been brought up to the surface. So from that point of view, the Tiny, it does a reasonable job in mixing and repellency, but it's designed for the mixing rather than repellency. Compared to something like a Plaza plough, which is more of a partial inversion, that gets probably a bit more or a bit better in terms of repellency or addressing repellency. And really, to get any further in addressing that is to do sort of like a mobile plough with a complete inversion. Will do a much better job, or spading. Of course, there's downsides for every machine, same as there's positives. So mobile plough, you really need the best conditions and good conditions, and there's a fair bit of skill in operating them. Something like the Plaza plough is a bit more forgiving, being discs. So it's a bit more forgiving of things like rocks, but they do take a lot of time and effort to set up. There's a bit more of an art to Plaza ploughing than what people think. It's not just whacking the discs in and off you go. Soil conditions play a big part, speed, angle, scallop shape of the disc. Yeah, so there's a lot of things that come into play when you're playing around Plazas. But like with most amelioration, it comes into, you really got to know the soil. So I was chatting to some of the guys earlier. One of the first things I do in a site like this, I'm thinking about ameliorating, is I'd dig a decent trench, decent hole, and I'd probably dig to at least 1 metre. So I'd be aiming for 1.2, 1.5 metres deep. Dig a decent trench, so you've got maybe 2 or 3 metres of soil pit face to look at, and having a look at where the roots are, what's happening, poke and prod it to see if there's any compaction bits, sample it for nutrition, and then you can take photos, and then you've got a bit of an idea about what's happening, and from that you can develop your plan as to what you want to do. So chatting to Theo is that acidity's not really an issue here by the sound of it in this paddock. From their sampling, the clay underneath is actually quite good, so it's not toxic, so it's a healthy clay for the soil. So there's no problems mixing that up and bringing it to the surface and crushing it up. Whereas if the clay underneath was poor and was sodic or toxic to some degree, something like the Tiny doing the job it's done here would end up making a bit of a mess and creating trouble. So just on that, is there anyone got any topics or questions or whatever? I chatted to a few guys earlier, which is some of the points that I'd potentially raise. All gone quiet now, the camera's on.
You were saying, I said to Michael, let's do a couple of double runs because it looked better. Oh, yeah. But you reckon that's not what we should be doing?
So there's, part of it for me is that my gut feel is that it may not necessarily be the best thing. And that's strictly from an erosion point of view at this time of the year. So we're not going to get a lot of green material growing on it from now onwards. So doing the double run has smashed it up a bit more and made it a bit more powdery. And it's something you've seen with like the refinator. Once the refinator goes through a few times, it just grinds it up to dust. And that then can create its own troubles. So my thoughts are on that is initially I'm a bit cautious, a bit uncertain as to how to play out the summer in terms of erosion risk. It is still quite cloddy after it, so you might get away with it. And being quite lumpy as it is, with it's a bit of undulation there from the Tiny. That may help it as well compared to something like a Spader, which is a bit more level. Yeah, being on a hilltop, it might be windier. So by leaving it as a single run, you're probably not increasing your depth much going twice. All you're doing is mixing it up more and smashing it.
Yeah.
So potentially you could wait until you get a little bit of moisture in it at the break of the season, and then crush it with a heavy ribbed roller or something to break up the bigger clods when there's a little bit of moisture in it, and that would then probably give you a much better seed bed and a bit safer than going over it double to try and crush them up, because that's all you're really doing is trying to smash it up more.
Yeah, no, that's what I was just looking at that going, we're going to have to do something about that. Whereas that there, you could leave it. But
yeah, but then there's the payoff. You can leave it, and then, well, you burn a diesel doing this as well. Yeah. So there's a diesel cost associated with going over it twice versus a roller, which is probably much higher on diesel. So there's those sorts of costs as well. There's a time aspect, and time takes to do twice. So it's doubling your time in paddock. And especially if you're hiring machinery or doing it by contract, that comes into it as well. So there's all these sorts of permutations and considerations. Personally, I think it's done a pretty good job on the one pass. So yeah, if you can access a heavy roller, that'd probably be the way that I'd look at it. But it's not. I'm not to say what to do. It's just giving you options and ideas and potential problems that might happen. So I was quite impressed with the amount of clay that's come up. So that's quite good. It's a little bit patchy. You can see where clay's come closer and shallower to the surface, and it's picked it up like this little patch here is a bit more clay in it. So it's done that quite well. So you should see something positive from that. Chatting to some of the other guys before, is it's rare to find just one problem in the paddock. So looking at this, I reckon there'd be a decent compaction issue deeper. Although, if you look through these clods in the clay, the roots are getting in there, so there's root pathways for them, so the roots are accessing it to some degree. So the question then is, once you get deep and below the depth this thing can dig at, which is probably about 25-30 centimetres, once you get deeper, you know, how much of that root zone, or how much of that soil zone is the other roots accessing? Or is it only the bits, you know, is it only going down to 20-30 centimetres? So, you know, in reality there's no reason why the roots can't get down past a metre during one season. It's just a case of whether or not they're constrained and they can't physically get there. So by digging a pit to start with, you can get a handle on where they are and how they're growing and which direction they're growing. Are they growing more sideways than down, as for one example. So that's something to think about when you dig in that hole, and it may then help you stack your amelioration options. So repellency is one big issue, yeah, but you know, you might have a bit of compaction there, there might be a bit of acidity pockets, you know, there could be anything like that. So unless you get a proper diagnosis or an understanding of the whole profile, you know, you maybe develop a plan. So if there's compaction, you set this up, do the tiny, you might increase your returns for a couple of years to bank the dollars that you spent to do it. Then you might think, okay, my next limitation is rooting depth, accessing water. So you might come through with a ripper of some sort to go that little bit deeper. So try and get the next level of increase. So yes, there's a lot of things that can be done. And nowadays with the machinery we've got and the variety of machinery, you're pretty well only limited by your imagination. So you just got to work out what you want to do, what you want to happen, where you want the steel to go through. We want the steel to lift, we want it to move it sideways, we want it to shatter. And all those sorts of decisions come into the type of tine you use, if it's a ripper, the type of machine you use, if it's a plough, is how you want the dirt to move, where you want it, what you want to put down, how you want it to mix. And so it's a combination of machine, moisture content, and soil type, soil conditions. Yeah.
What about tine spacings on a deep ripping machine?
There's soil type, moisture content, depth. They influence it all. Yeah.
Variable. What's the range then?
Oh, whatever you want. You can have tine spacings as narrow as 30 centimetres. Would do. And then it's a case of horsepower and tine thickness. So tine thickness has a difference. So you know, you can get narrow shank tines and thick shank tines. You can get tines with wing points on the base. You can get mixing wings halfway up. You can vertical tines. You can get forward facing tines, delving tines. So they all impact how the soil moves under the surface, and combined with that, not only is it the tine design, but also moisture content, soil conditions, speed can play a part. You know, so there's a lot of things that come into play when it's not as simple as just ripping into it and going and burning through some diesel.
How do you know what you need then?
Dig a hole.
Dig a hole, David.
Yeah, come on, mate.
Dig a hole.
I can dig a hole. That's easy. Then what do I do?
Been doing that
You dig
most
the
of
hole.
the time.
You dig the hole, so we'll come and have a look.
Yeah. And you tell us what you're going to do.
Most of the agronomists have an understanding of what's required, and what the soil face looks like and where it's compacted and where the roots are growing. And it's a case of sampling and working out a strategy of where you want that soil to move. So if you've got some nice soil underneath that might be pH of 6.5,
Yeah.
but your mid soil or top soil's 4.5, well, the obvious thing is there to try and get some of that clay up and mix it into the top bit. You know?
We won't have that here.
No. What, the acidity or the clay?
6.5 down there. It'll be bloody 3.5.
Well, that's right. But then there's a case of, if it's 3.5, you want to leave it down there. So you don't want a delving tine, you just want a straight shank tine that allows the root to grow through. Some of the responses we've seen with ripping have been around drainage. So the ripping's just shattered the subsoil, it's allowed the water to drain through.
Yeah.
In warlord country.
Yeah. You talk about mixing, using this to mix lime.
Yep.
So if you were going down, say 250, and you knew at 250 your pH was 3.5 or 4.
Yep.
How much lime would you put on in front of that to help?
How much money you got?
Not really expensive if he's going to use that.
It comes down. Part of it comes down to cash flow.
Yeah.
But if it's I don't know. There's some guys down south that have been in the grazing, like high rainfall country around Albany. One of the guys in there, he's put on 10, 15 tonne of lime in one season.
To the hectare, in front of something like this.
No, that was just on top initially, and there was just shallow digging.
Yeah.
But so it comes down to what you're trying to achieve,
Yeah.
and how much you think you're going to need. So if you're around 4.5, I wouldn't hesitate to put on say 3 tonne, 4 tonne, if I had the cash. It all comes down to cash flow.
Yeah.
But if you're going to use that, you might be better off investing in some lime to bury, because it's a lot easier to come back and top dress it afterwards.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right.
So if you've got a budget for 4 tonne of lime, you might be better off putting most of that on top and then mix a bit. And some of it's going to be on the surface anyway.
Yeah.
It's using that thing, it's it's not all buried. But the other thing about lime is that I don't know anyone that follows Twitter and whatnot. There was a conversation a year or two ago from Ronnie Edmonds up at Clingery, where he'd been applying lime. He put 10 tonne on over probably 8 years, 7 or 8 years, or it might be 8 tonne over 10 years, I can't remember, one of the two. But his pH below 10, 15 centimetres hadn't changed.
Yeah.
And it's once you raise the pH at the soil surface in that soil surface area, there's no more lime's going to move through no matter how much you put on, because it needs to be acidic to dissolve.
Yeah.
So if you apply more lime on top of neutral soil, it's just going to sit there as free lime.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you've applied 1 tonne every year, or every couple of years, 1.5 tonne, you've changed the pH to the top 5-10 centimetres.
Yep.
That's not going to filter through in any great hurry. Probably not before I retire.